It's Friday the 16th of December, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh and Cardiff, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent, David Cornick. On the programme this week...
What do we want?
Pay rise!
How do we get it?
Strike!
What do we want?
As nurses strike for the first time in England, the Prime Minister clashes with the Labour leader.
Nurses going on strike is a badge of shame for this government.
If he thinks it's right that pay demands of 19% are met, then he should say so.
But nurses are also striking in Labour-run Wales.
We are tied entirely by the decisions that are made on pay by his colleagues in Westminster.
You constantly talk about wanting more powers. You have the powers over terms and conditions within the NHS.
Following loss of life in the English Channel, the Home Secretary condemns people smugglers.
We are working so hard to destroy the business model of the people smugglers. Evil, organised criminals who treat human beings as cargo.
The UK and French governments and authorities have failed to stop the criminal and smuggler and trafficking gangs proliferating around the Channel.
And the cricketer driven out of the country by threats and abuse.
Moving abroad is not an easy thing, especially when you've got ill parents, and it's difficult.
Welcome to the programme. David, let's start here in Westminster. This week has been dominated by strike action, including rail workers, postal services, and for the first time, nurses. There's been a lot going on, hasn't there?
There has, Leila, an awful lot. And really, those strikes, that industrial unrest, that's been the backdrop to the whole political week at Westminster. Now, we've got used to trains being cancelled, to the post not arriving. But when you have a nurses' strike in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, although not in Scotland, well, that's bound to raise the political temperature. And you've also got to factor in things like an approaching possible strike by ambulance workers. So the government's been having to make contingency plans, train soldiers and so on. The emergency committee meeting, COBRA, that's been meeting too. And Labour forced a health minister, to come to the Commons to answer an urgent question to explain what's been going on.
The power to stop these strikes lies squarely with the government and the Secretary of State. The Royal College of Nursing and Unison have said they will call off strikes this week if they are willing to negotiate with them seriously on pay. This is a reasonable offer of compromise that is surely too good to refuse. So what on earth are they playing at?
The gentleman opposite and his party leader are too tied to their union paymasters to be on the side of patients. Now, he knows, Mr. Speaker, he knows that we have an independent pay review body, and it's important that both sides respect that independent body. An independent body, Mr. Speaker, whose recommendations we accepted this year's increase in full.
I have more information about my train services over the next few weeks than I do about health services. Is the Minister satisfied that patients have enough information about what is being affected and when, and how much that will impact on the backlog? Because I suspect none of this will help some of those workload pressures that are impacting our NHS.
Patients should continue to call 999 as normal if it is an emergency, if someone is seriously ill or injured. If they do not have life-threatening conditions, use NHS 111. Ambulances will still be responding to 999 calls. And if patients have appointments, please turn up unless advised to do so.
This places a huge burden on our armed forces. Could I ask the Minister, firstly, are all the units that may be required to mobilise, have they been informed already? And is it now time, if we are going to see strikes on this level, for minimal service levels to be introduced by departments to make sure that our armed forces are not overwhelmed?
Well, Mr. Speaker, representing a garrison city of Colchester, I have nothing but the utmost respect for our armed forces. And it hasn't escaped my notice, Mr. Speaker, that many of whom are on lower pay than NHS staff will be giving up their time over Christmas to cover strike action.
I was a nurse for 25 years. Nurses work long hours, day in, day out, to support people all over the country, often on very low pay. I know from experience how tough it can be, and it's shameful that many hospitals have opened food banks, especially to feed their staff. Mr. Speaker, let's be absolutely clear. The power to stop these strikes that even nurses themselves don't really want lies squarely with the government.
I've been out on shift with my local ambulance service. I've seen how hard they work and how important what they do is. We are really grateful for what they do. My constituents are worried. Can he confirm if the ambulance strikes go ahead, which categories of call we will ensure are responded to?
999 calls are triaged and categorised from Category 1 to Category 4, and on days of ambulance strike action, it's likely that Category 1 and Category 2 calls, where there's an immediate threat to life, will be responded to, and we are looking at ways in which we can provide additional support for Category 3 and Category 4, including things like block booking, taxis.
We've already got huge workforce shortages. 40,000 nurses resigned last year, and there are more than 130,000 vacancies across the NHS. So cancelling Christmas for members of the armed forces isn't going to fix these problems. Can the Minister explain how paying nurses insufficiently and drafting in military personnel over Christmas serves to attract new recruits to the NHS and to the armed forces?
We've already recruited around 29,000 more nurses. We're on track to meet our 50,000 target, and we plan to boost international recruitment. But I hope, Mr. Speaker, my humble friend, not just in the interests of our armed forces who will have to cancel, many of whom will have to cancel their Christmas leave, but of course in the interests of patient safety, will agree with me that we do not want to see industrial action taking place, and I again would urge the unions to meet with us to discuss a way forward.
Discussion there about the nurses' strike in the Commons. David, the issue also dominated Prime Minister's questions this week. It was the last one of the year, with Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer clashing over the nurses' strike.
Yeah, the last Prime Minister's questions of this year of three Prime Ministers, and small landmark, Rishi Sunak this week overtook Liz Truss's time in Downing Street, so some small consolation for him given his political difficulties. Not a lot of Christmas good cheer around at question time, it has to be said. Now, we know with this dispute that both sides say they're willing to talk, but not about the same things. So what happened at Prime Minister's questions was that the Labour leader really tried to pin the blame for the dispute firmly at the door of Rishi Sunak.
Mr. Speaker, tomorrow will be the first ever nationwide nurses' strike. All the Prime Minister has to do to stop that is to open the door and discuss pay with them. If he did, the whole country would breathe a sigh of relief. Why won't he?
Prime Minister. Last year, when everyone else in the public sector had a public sector pay freeze, the nurses received a 3% pay rise. When the RCN asked for more in-work training, we gave every nurse and midwife a £1,000 training budget. And when they asked for nurses' bursaries, we made sure that every nursing student received a £5,000 grant. That's because we do work constructively, and we will continue to back our nurses.
There is a human cost. Alex from Chester has been waiting for a gallbladder operation for nearly 6 months. He's in so much pain, he's been off school since then. His operation has already been cancelled twice. His mum, who I spoke to this morning, is worried sick. When she heard that strikes could be called off, she was massively relieved. She's desperate for the Prime Minister to resolve this. All he needs to do is simply meet the nurses. Now, Alex's mum is listening to this. She doesn't want to hear him blaming everybody else. She doesn't want his usual ducking of the question. She's tuned in now because she wants him to explain what is he going to do to resolve the nursing strike.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's not just Alex. There are millions of others across this country, Alex and Mark, millions of others Millions of others who will have their healthcare disrupted because of the strike. Now, the honourable gentleman says to get round the table, but we all know what that means, Mr. Speaker. That is just simply a political formula for avoiding taking a position on this issue. If he thinks the strikes are wrong, he should say so. If he thinks it's right that pay demands of 19% are met, then he should say so. What's weak, Mr. Speaker, is he's not strong enough to stand up to the union.
Thanks to positive and proactive negotiations between the Scottish Government and Unite and Unison health unions, a pay settlement has been reached and strike action averted. By stark contrast, the UK Health Secretary appears completely unwilling to negotiate with unions on pay, and strike action is very much still on the table. So may I ask the Prime Minister, when will he see the error of his ways and follow the Scottish Government's lead?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad the UK Government was able to provide £1.5 billion in extra funding to the Scottish Government for public services. The Health Secretary and other ministers have engaged fully, not just with the unions, but with an independent pay-setting process, which takes the politics out of the process and ensures that we can meet those independent requirements with a fair pay deal.
I lost both my parents to cancer as a child. And so, like many people across the country and in this House, I know the devastating impact of treatment delays on cancer patients and their families. Can he give a cast-iron guarantee that the dreadful cancer backlog won't get any worse? And second, when will the government meet its own cancer target?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very sorry to hear about the right honourable gentleman's parents. Indeed, I'm sure many of us across this House have our families have been tragically affected by what cancer does, and he's right to raise the importance of meeting our targets. And what I am able to tell him is we actually are experiencing very high numbers of cancer referrals following the pandemic. He'll be aware of that. But thanks to the brilliant work of our NHS staff, cancer treatment rates in the most recent month for which we have data are now back at pre-pandemic levels, with a plan for them to increase further. And recently the NHS also announced plans to fast-track patients direct to cancer tests rather than have to wait for specialist consultation first. These measures will make a difference, and I look forward to updating on them in the new year.
Prime Minister's questions there. But also this week in the Commons, MPs have approved legislation which means voters will be required to produce photo ID before they can vote. David, just talk us through why this has been brought in and what it actually means for people.
It means that if you're planning to vote in the English Council elections next May, you will need an official form of photo ID to be able to cast your vote, and that'll be a passport or a driving licence. If you haven't got either of those or something else that's official, then you can apply to your local council for a free voter authority certificate. Now, the government argues this is needed to combat voter fraud, but critics say that the plans are really a sledgehammer to crack a nut, that voter fraud isn't that big a problem. Ministers say you will in future need it for general elections too, so it will be a big issue. But certainly when it came to the debate among MPs, the argument from critics and opponents was that it would actually deter people from voting, particularly younger people.
We will be fulfilling a government manifesto commitment to protect the integrity of our democracy by introducing identification to vote at polling stations. Gaps in our current legislation leave open the potential for someone to cast another vote at the polling station. Our priority is adopting legislation that ensures the public can have confidence in the integrity of our elections and certainty that their vote belongs to them and them alone.
The basic fact is voter ID is not only a backward step for democracy, but completely pointless. It's a solution in search of a problem. Over the last 10 years, there have been about 243 million votes cast in elections. And how many people have been convicted of voter fraud? 4, Mr Deputy Speaker. That's 0.0000005%.
My seat of North Swindon, as part of the Swindon Borough Council, was one of the initial pilots. I can't remember whether it was 2017 or 2018. And I just wanted to give a few quick observations. First of all, turnout was up, not down. And when the pilot came to an end and we weren't part of the bigger pilot, we were inundated with complaints as people thought it was a far better system, which is why I'm very pleased to advocate this very much welcome change.
These regulations on voter ID need to be seen within the context of an authoritarian drift by this government, which has in its sights the right to peacefully protest, the right to take strike action, and the right to vote with ease. So it's profoundly disturbing.
So, David, MPs approved the legislation and it went to the House of Lords the following day. What happened there? Well,
it went to the Lords, which is where, of course, the government doesn't have a majority. So things politically got a bit more interesting. The Liberal Democrats tried to kill it with one blow. That failed, but Labour did manage to get a concession. And what the government has agreed is that after those council elections in May, there will be an independent review to look at things, whether it does put off people from voting. And they've agreed that review will report back by next November. So probably well before the next election.
David, thank you. We will be back with you a bit later. But for now, we're going to go to Scotland, where it's budget week. Let's go to our reporter, Jenny Davidson in Holyrood, who can tell us all about it.
Well, a bit of drama here at Holyrood, actually. At one point, it looked like the budget statement might not even go ahead after some parts of it were leaked to the BBC. It's something that Presiding Officer Alison Johnson is known to take very seriously, and she has refused to let a government statement go ahead in the past after it was leaked to the media. Now, when it came to the budget statement time, she announced a half-hour delay while she investigated this leak. In the end, she did allow the budget statement to go ahead, but she made it very clear she wasn't happy.
I cannot express strongly enough my disappointment at information about this afternoon's statement appearing in the media before being given to the Parliament. I have spoken to the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister to express my concern in the strongest possible concerns, and they have given me a categoric assurance that this information was not shared by the government. In the interests, thank you. In the interests, excuse me, members, thank you. In the interests of parliamentary scrutiny, and so that members are not disadvantaged, I will allow the statement to be made so that full information about the budget is available to members, public services and the public.
This was always going to be a tough budget, coming as it does amid inflation, energy price rises and these near-daily strikes we've seen in recent weeks. Now coming into the budget, Deputy First Minister John Swinney, who's also the Acting Finance Secretary, he said that it was a spectacularly difficult time for public finances. Now, one of the leading economic think tanks here, the Fraser-Vallender Institute, had said that the money come to Scotland announced in the Chancellor's autumn statement would even things out in terms of inflation, but it's still a very tough time for public finances. And the big question had been, how would John Swinney raise more money? What would he do with the devolved tax-raising powers that he has? And there's certainly been some movement on that. Here's what John Swinney had to say.
This budget strengthens the social contract between the Scottish Government and every citizen of Scotland for the wider benefit of society. This social contract means that people in Scotland continue to enjoy many benefits not available throughout the United Kingdom, including free prescriptions, free access to higher education and the Scottish Child Payment. It also means that in Scotland, families are shielded as far as possible from the welfare cuts and austerity policies of the United Kingdom Government. Presiding Officer, on income tax, I intend to maintain the thresholds for the starter and basic rate bands at their current levels. I confirm I will also maintain the higher rate threshold at its current level, and I will lower the top rate threshold from £150,000 to £125,140. I also intend to make no changes to the starter, basic and intermediate rates to protect those on lower incomes. I have decided to increase the higher and top rates of tax by 1 pence each to 42 pence and 47 pence respectively. As a result, we are asking all those earning more than £43,662 to pay an extra penny in income tax, and I want to be clear that extra penny is being raised for a specific purpose. We've taken the decision to enable us to exceed the health resource Barnett consequentials from the UK Government with substantial additional investment in the National Health Service, an investment that will benefit us all. The Scottish Government respects the decision of the Supreme Court, but still believes the people of Scotland must have the opportunity to have that say in a democratic referendum in line with our clear mandate. And when that opportunity is available, the Scottish Government will make financial provisions for that to happen. However, at this moment, I must make full use of the resources available to me. One of the reasons why I believe Scotland will be a successful independent country is because of the energy wealth that we enjoy. Scotland is a country with an abundance of renewable energy opportunities. The travesty, however, is that despite that strength, too many of our people languish in fuel poverty. In order to help our most vulnerable citizens, I intend to utilise the finance earmarked for a referendum on independence to make provision to extend our fuel insecurity fund into next year, a further £20 million to address yet another failure of the United Kingdom and its policies. Many in our communities, the people who send us here, are suffering real and enduring hardship. And all of this is happening at a time when our country needs to adapt to the challenges of net zero and face the hard reality of severe constraints in the public finances. In that context, this government has decided to use our scope to take distinctive decisions to the greatest extent we believe possible at this time. We have chosen to reject the path of austerity. We have chosen a progressive path instead, to invest in our people, to invest in our economy, and to invest in our public services.
John Swinney has said that the changes he's making in this budget will raise just over £500 million in the next financial year to spend on public services. Now, there's no question about this budget being passed. The SNP entered into a cooperation agreement with the Greens in August last year, so it's got their backing. But nevertheless, the opposition parties made their feelings known. Here's what the Conservatives and Labour finance spokespeople had to say.
If you raise taxes, Mr Swinney, the public wants to know why they see only cuts and a deterioration in the delivery of public services. And if you widen the tax gap for middle and higher earners in Scotland in comparison with their UK counterparts, you risk undermining the potential for economic growth that this country so desperately needs. So the Scottish Conservatives very much look forward to the forthcoming Stage 1 process, in which we will set out where Mr Swinney can further reprioritise money to frontline services, including to local government, to policing, to net zero, a reprioritisation which means withdrawing the huge spending commitment to the National Care Service, which very few stakeholders want at all, and removing that commitment to the bogus referendum.
Scottish Labour will always support progressive taxation, but we are also clear that if you're going to take progressive tax measures, you must demonstrate clear improvements to public services. But the statement today, with a manifesto-busting measure, does not do this. People will not accept a rise in tax bills if all they see is further decline of their services after 15 years of the SNP's mismanagement of them. Nor will they tolerate this tax hike if they see the ranks of spin doctors, quangos and civil servants swell.
This is just the first stage of the budget process, with stages 2 and 3 to come after Christmas, and no doubt there'll be more wrangling over the detail to come.
Jenny, thank you. Jenny Davidson there reporting at the Scottish Parliament. Now, let's return to Westminster and catch up with David Cornock. David, this week we had that tragic news, didn't we, that at least 4 people died after a migrant boat got into difficulties crossing the English Channel in this freezing weather. We will, of course, discuss that in a moment. But actually, earlier in the week, the Prime Minister set out a series of proposals to try to tackle this issue of people crossing the Channel in small boats. What did he have to say?
Yeah, it's an issue, really, that's been close to the top of Rishi Sunak's in tray since he entered Downing Street. He's been under pressure from Conservative MPs, both over the scale of people coming in small boats, more than 40,000 this year, and also the delays, the backlog in actually processing their applications for asylum when they're here in the UK. Now, what he unveiled was a 5-point plan, quite striking that it was the Prime Minister and not the Home Secretary who was in charge of the plan and chose to introduce it. Now, that plan includes a deal with Albania to make it easier to return their nationals, more people to process claims over here, and also he's promising to make it harder for people to use modern slavery laws to avoid deportation. Now, by and large, this all went down very well with Conservative MPs, but as we'll see in a moment, with one notable exception.
It is unfair that people come here illegally. It is unfair on those with a genuine case for asylum when our capacity to help is taken up by people coming through and from countries that are perfectly safe. One of the reasons we struggle to remove people is because they unfairly exploit our modern slavery system. So we will significantly raise the threshold someone has to meet to be considered a modern slave. For the first time, we will actually require a caseworker to have objective evidence of modern slavery rather than just a suspicion. Mr. Speaker, I said enough is enough, and I mean it, and that means I am prepared to do what must be done. So early next year, we will introduce new legislation to make unambiguously clear that if you enter the UK illegally, you should not be able to remain here.
The Prime Minister sat around the Cabinet table the whole time. Where there should have been solutions, we've had unworkable gimmicks. And Mr. Speaker, as I listened to that statement, all of that has been said almost word for word before. The last time we had measures, the last time we had legislation. Plenty of newspaper headlines about wave machines, prison ships, fantasy islands, but no effective action. All designed to mask failure, to distract from a broken asylum system that can't process claims, can't return those with no right to be here, and can't protect our borders.
People smuggling and human trafficking are distinct and separate crimes and should not be treated or spoken of as one, and that modern slavery is a very real and current threat, with too many people brought to this country into slavery, and that we must do nothing to diminish our world-leading protections for the victims of this terrible, horrific crime.
Nobody is illegal, and indeed there is no such thing as an illegal asylum seeker. But what we all agree upon, Mr. Speaker, is that the UK's system is broken, and we can't, of course, escape from the fact who has broken it.
Hear, hear. I live in a place called the real world, and in the real world, people know that the vast majority of people travelling here on small boats are not genuine refugees. Even last week at the Home Affairs Select Committee, the Albanian ambassador admitted that everybody coming from Albania are economic migrants. They're coming here because they can't come through a legal route by getting visas, so they come on small boats. So the public get it, even the Albanian ambassador gets it, we all get it. Prime Minister, when will the opposition get it and realise that the vast majority that are coming over are not genuine asylum seekers?
He's absolutely right. We on this side of the House are on the side of the British people. It's as simple as that. The opposition today have put forward no plans, no action, and have not at all And we'll soon see, Mr. Speaker, when we bring forward legislation to stop the boats, they have a choice. Do they want to back our legislation and be on the side of the British people?
Plenty of strong feelings there in the Commons about the issue of asylum seekers. We mentioned briefly earlier that 4 people died on Wednesday trying to cross the Channel, and the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, made a statement to the House about that incident. What did she say?
Yeah, news of the incident, and there were around 40 people rescued from the boat as well. News of that incident broke really in the small hours after we'd heard from Rishi Sunak's statement about his plan. Now, Suella Braverman came to update MPs, and it was quite striking, really, I think, the tone of the whole debate, and that this is a hugely contentious political issue, but the tone set by the Home Secretary and indeed by other MPs in the wake of the news we heard from the English Channel was very solemn.
Crossing the Channel in unseaworthy vessels is a lethally dangerous endeavour. It is for this reason, above all, that we are working so hard to destroy the business model of the people smugglers, evil, organised criminals who treat human beings as cargo.
The other brutal truth is that far from stopping those criminal gangs, those gangs have grown and grown. And the UK and French governments and authorities have failed to stop the criminal and smuggler and trafficking gangs proliferating around the Channel. Those gangs have created a multi-million-pound criminal industry with lives at stake, and the action against those gangs has been too weak.
Can she update the House about any progress she may be having in discussions with her French counterparts, which will persuade them either to intercept those boats if they get into the water and bring the passengers back to French land from where they started, or when they do intercept people on the beaches about to get into the boats, that they are arrested and detained rather than set free and allowed to try again the following night. That is the only thing that is really going to stop this immediately, as we need it to happen.
I'm very proud of the new agreement that we have struck with our French colleagues in this regard, and already there has been progress. In the last few weeks, there have been initial deployments of embedded officers under the deal, with the first full deployments before Christmas.
The Home Secretary has told us, quite rightly, that safe and legal routes are effective in bringing people here. That's why you never find Ukrainians or people from Hong Kong in these small boats. So why does she think that the creation of safe and legal routes for people coming from places like Syria, Eritrea or Afghanistan has to wait for the Home Office to get its act together?
It's clear that fundamentally we have to send the message to anybody thinking about coming to the UK that you must do it through a legal means, you must do it through a lawful route, and jumping the queue, putting your life and that of others at risk is not an acceptable way of coming to the United Kingdom.
This government's policy is cruel, inhumane and puts people at risk of danger, exploitation and, as we tragically saw last night, death. It's clear that to stop deaths in the Channel, we need safe routes to claim asylum.
What is cruel and inhumane is desperate people being conned into a trick to hand over large sums of money, make a treacherous journey on land and on sea, in the hope, the fruitless hope of a better life in the United Kingdom. That is not lawful, it is not moral, and it must be stopped.
That incident really focusing minds again. David, thank you for being with us. We will be back again with you a bit later on. But for now, let's go over to Cardiff and our Wales political reporter, Cemlyn Davis. Cemlyn, a big week in the Senedd as the Welsh Government presented its draft budget for next year.
Yes, that's right. On Tuesday, the Finance Minister set out how the Welsh Government intends to spend its £20 billion budget for the next financial year. There has been some extra money from the UK Government, and there will be more money for health and for councils. Businesses will also get some extra support, and social carers will get a pay rise, bringing their salaries in line with the real living wage. But given given the economic context at the moment, there was a stark warning from Rebecca Evans too that things will be tight and that the money won't go as far as had been hoped.
This is a draft budget unlike any other that we've laid since the start of devolution. It's been one of the toughest that we've ever made, reflecting the perfect storm of economic and budgetary pressures facing Wales, none of which are of our making. A decade of austerity has been compounded by the ongoing and long-term impacts of Brexit, the pandemic and our recovery from it, the economic and humanitarian consequences of the war in Ukraine, and now an unprecedented cost of living crisis which affects every aspect of daily life and business.
This has to be, and it needs to be, a budget of delivery. And the Welsh Government needs to show that it has a plan to spend the money in a way that financially tackles the long-standing issues that we face in Wales, as well as responding to the issues we currently face.
In very many ways, it's a very sad budget. You know, you look at it and think the difficult decisions that are having to be made, but also knowing that for many people, it's not going to make a huge difference to their lives. You know, someone wrote to me this week, nothing is getting better, everything is getting worse day by day. Even some of the handouts that I have received are just not making any difference. What will change for me? And what promises can you make? Well, it's extremely difficult because even looking at this budget, the questions that we are being asked are not going to be solved or addressed.
Heledd Vychan there. Well, local authorities have been responding to the announcement too. They've welcomed the extra support that they'll be getting, but they've also warned it'll only help to plug around half of the £780 million gap in local government budgets across Wales. The rest of the money will have to be found either by cutting services or increasing council tax bills. And in fact, one local authority, Newport Council, have already confirmed this week that they're now looking at the possibility of increasing council tax by 9.5%.
And we've been already talking about nurses going on strike in England, Northern Ireland and Wales, and it was also discussed at the Senate this week, wasn't it? What was said?
Yes, that's right, because here in Wales too, some 17,000 members of the Royal College of Nursing have been out on the picket line on strike over pay. And as you say, this was discussed here on Tuesday during First Minister's questions when there were some very passionate exchanges between the First Minister and the other political leaders here in the Senedd. Mark Drakeford, the Labour First Minister, faced criticism for failing to negotiate with the union, but he said that the Welsh Government would only be able to offer more money to nurses if it received extra funding from the UK Government.
We are tied entirely by the decisions that are made on pay by his colleagues in Westminster. That is the place that he should be lobbying. The minute that his ministers are prepared to make a better offer for nurses in England, we will be able to make that offer here in Wales.
I understand it is a difficult situation. I understand money is tight, but you constantly talk about wanting more powers. You have the powers over terms and conditions within the NHS. You have the levers financially to raise more revenue if you choose to do that. You have, by this budget today, which you've laid, chosen not to do that, but you've had £1.2 billion worth of extra money. You also have an uplift in the finance from Wales for every pound that is spent in England to £1.20 in Wales. Yes. You have taken a political decision to have this fight here in Wales rather than use the tools available to you to resolve it.
Andrew Arty-Davis there making the point that if it wanted to, the Welsh Government could raise more money by using its limited income tax varying powers. Well, in response to that, Mark Drakeford, the First Minister, said that no serious government would consider raising taxes given the current economic context. He also said that the only way that the government could put more money in nurses' pay packets without extra funding from the UK government would be by taking money out of NHS resources. Well, or NHS services rather, and that argument led to this response from Plaid Cymru's leader, Adam Price.
I think it's astonishing that you're attacking the Tories in Westminster when you're doing exactly the same in Wales and refusing to talk about pay to the unions. And, I just disagree philosophically with the First Minister. I do not see that actually investing in better pay and conditions for the workforce is actually diverting money out of the NHS. It's investing in the long-term sustainable future of the NHS, because without those nurses, those doctors and NHS staff, what future is there for the service at all?
The difference between us, is not philosophical at all. It's simply practical. He wants to take £120 million out of activity that the NHS in Wales is committed to undertake. And would use that money to pay people. That's a practical choice. Our choice has had to be different because we see the enormous pressures that the NHS faces every single day.
Mark Drakeford there, and that was, of course, the final FMQs of 2022. MSs will be back here in the new year after the Christmas break.
Cemlyn, thank you. Cemlyn Davis there in the Welsh Parliament. Now, back to events at Westminster. David, cricket was in the spotlight in Parliament this week when MPs heard from the former Yorkshire cricketer, Azeem Rafiq. What did he say?
Azeem Rafiq is best known as the Yorkshire bowler who blew the whistle on racism in cricket. In November last year, he gave evidence to MPs on the Digital Culture, Media and Sports Committee about some of the abuse he had suffered playing professional sport for the county. Now, that led to big changes at the county and in cricket more widely. But this week, the MPs invited him back to hear what had changed since then. And his evidence, sadly, was still quite distressing in parts.
People have got in touch to apologise, and that, on a human level, has meant the world to me. I've also had a platform and an opportunity to speak and hopefully help these things being eradicated and hopefully make better throughout society. The downside and the difficult bits that have been that my family has been the target of abuse, threats and attacks. Recently, my family house, there's a bloke in broad daylight who basically walked in and out of the garden on the phone before defecating, bringing a loo roll, and it looked all very planned. We had another incident where a gentleman late at night was circling with what looked like a chain in his hand.
In a changing room, a sporting changing room, I know that banter goes backwards and forwards. When does banter become racism? How do we define this? How do we police it, if we do at all?
I hate the word. I think for me, one man's banter is another person's demise. And where does it cross it? And, there's been lots of attempts to downplay what I actually went through. Bar staff at places were calling me the P word. It's just not banter. It really isn't. And as I've said, I think banter is used as an excuse to make someone feel isolated.
You think that there's been an attempt from sections of the media to focus on you and make you the issue to avoid having to deal with the wider issue in cricket of racism?
There's been a lot written about me over the last 13 months. I've made mistakes in my life. One of the first things that came out a couple of days after Select Committee was anti-Semitic messages that I had made. I did exactly what I asked everyone else to do, which is apologise, accept, and go, the journey bit, but, try and make some learnings as to why I made them comments.
A year on, and you've given us some really deeply disturbing evidence today, including saying, and I saw the faces of my fellow committee members, you said somebody had come and defecated in your garden. I mean, beyond disgusting. What's the last year been like for your family?
I've left the country. I don't really want to go into too much of the details of it, but, there was a point in the summer because of the constant pressure. At times we were getting hounded 6 to 7 times a week by the press. Like I said, moving abroad is not an easy thing, especially when you've got ill parents, and it's difficult.
Powerful testimony there from Azeem Rafiq. David, thank you very much for being with us on the programme today. That's all from Politics UK for this week and this year. Parliament sits for 2 days next week before rising for Christmas. We will be back next year on Friday the 13th of January. But before that, Joe Coburn will be back with Politics Live on Monday at 12:15 on BBC Two and on iPlayer. Have a very good weekend. Bye-bye.